This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Underdogs dot the landscape of sports history. They're great topics for fun discussions. The 1980 U.S. hockey team taking down the USSR. The 1966 Texas Western men's basketball team beating Kentucky in the NCAA championship game. James Braddock taking down Max Baer in the heavyweight championship. Buster Douglas doing the same to Mike Tyson. As golf's U.S. Open approaches, there's another great underdog story to look back upon. A golfer whom time has forgotten, but a golfer who wielded a mighty sword for one special weekend in 1955 at San Francisco's famous Olympic Club. Jack Fleck.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 132, Jack Fleck. What a story! A golfer whom time has forgotten. A golfer who outlasted one of the most mythical names in sports history, Ben Hogan. Yes, the Hawk. One of the most intimidating figures to ever walk the fairways of a golf course. Hogan was the man to beat. He had won the U.S. Open in 1948, 1950, 1951, and 1953. He was aiming for a record-setting fifth U.S. Open championship, the crowning achievement to one of the greatest careers in golf history. In fact, many experts say, had Hogan won in 1955, he would have stepped away from the game immediately thereafter and called it a career. A great way to put a stamp on one of the greatest careers in the history of sports. Jack Fleck was a Hogan fanatic. He fashioned his game after Bantam Ben. In fact, on more than one occasion, Fleck would finish a round and then go back out on the course and discreetly follow Hogan as Ben meticulously took apart golf's most challenging courses. Fleck struggled throughout his career, nothing more than an also-ran. Once in a while, he'd crack the top 10, but he had never won. 1955 was to be it. If he didn't find a way to win a tournament, he would call it a career and head back to the pro shop. 1955 was not going well for Fleck. However, he did manage to qualify for the 1955 U.S. Open. His first round was not great, shooting a 6 over 76, but the course was tough. Many called it a terror, so by no means was Fleck out of it. But he was 9 behind the leader, Tommy Bolt. Slowly, he worked his way up the leaderboard and ultimately found himself in a playoff with Hogan after shooting a 3 under 67 in the final round. Then came the 18-hole playoff, an incredibly magical day for Jack Fleck. 18 holes of golf that entered him into golf lore. On this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes, we are going to look back on the career of Jack Fleck with my special guest, Neil Sagebiel, and talk a lot about the 1955 U.S. Open. Neil wrote a terrific book about Fleck and the Open called The Longest Shot. Neil spoke to Fleck in depth about 1955 and his career. It's a very enjoyable discussion, and I hope you all like it. As always, please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Check out Sports Forgotten Heroes on Facebook, and please give the podcast a nice review and a 5-star rating wherever you listen or watch. And as always, thanks for your support. Okay, let's get into today's show with my special guest, Neil Sagebiel. Neil, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So happy you could be here.
Thanks, Warren. It's good to be with you.
Hey, man, really interesting topic. At least I think so. Jack Fleck. I mean, the master of one of the greatest upsets in the history of sports, beating Ben Hogan in the 1955 U.S. Open. And I can't think of too many other upsets of that magnitude. What about yourself?
That's what really got me interested. Yeah, I remember when I was starting to research this topic that I saw an ESPN article that ranked it in the top 10. And I know these are subjective things, but it was right up there with some of the biggest upsets, like USA hockey, Buster Douglas beating Mike Tyson, the Jets beating the Colts, with Joe Namath, things like that. And I thought, wow, that's really amazing. I had known about it in golf, but the fact that it fits into, those handful of greatest sports upsets was really compelling for me.
Yeah, when I decided to do this particular podcast on Jack, I started to think to myself, what other golfers could you put in that same category as an unlikely winner? And really, it's very difficult to find something comparable. In recent times, I think the one name that rings a bell for me, although circumstances quite different because he didn't upset the great Ben Hogan, or in our time here, a Jack Nicklaus. But the name that came up for me was John Daly when he won his first PGA championship. That's sort of like the only unlikely winner that compares to a guy like Jack Fleck, because nobody knew who John Daly was. He was an alternate.
I remember that. No, we didn't know who he was, and he just came out of nowhere. And to get that opportunity, it's rare to see it. And when you see it in a major championship like that, it's hard to fathom. I know when this book came out, and I was doing media at that time, well, a lot of people were still talking about when Rocco Mediate took Tiger to a playoff, and it went extra holes, but he didn't quite pull it off. But people were still amazed. They were just spellbound by how Rocco could play with him.
But Rocco had won previously, right? He had won tournaments previously. Fleck never won, and Daly never won. I mean, they really came out of nowhere. Nobody knew who these guys were, period. And I think that's what makes these stories, particularly the Jack Fleck story, even that much more amazing.
I totally agree with you on that.
So who was Jack Fleck? And I don't mean he was the guy who won the 1955 U.S. Open. I mean, who was he? Tell us about him. What kind of person was he? How he learned the game? Where did he come from? Who was Jack Fleck?
Well, that was the question. As I've been thinking about talking to you, that was the question that drove me. Who was Jack Fleck, and how did he do this? Those were the two main drivers. And Jack was a man from Iowa. He grew up pretty modest means. You might even say poor. And he took an interest in golf. Like a lot of guys of his era, he came up through golf in the caddy ranks. He got a job as a caddy. He fell in love with the game, and he decided he played for his high school golf team. He was from Bettendorf, Iowa, which is on the Mississippi. and he was an okay high school golfer, but he had a desire to make it his profession. And even his high school golf coach said, I don't know about that, Jack. And part of that was his temperament. But he got in, he became an assistant golf pro. And then he did make it his profession. And by the time we're in the early 50s in this time frame of this story, he is the head pro at 2 city golf courses in Davenport, Iowa. And he loved the game, and he worked long hours like a lot of the guys did back then. Even the guys who were playing the tour, which looked a lot different than it does now. I mean, they were scrapping for whatever they could make, doing the thing they love. It wasn't at all like today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He loved the game, and he wanted, as he came into this 55 season, he'd been out and played a little bit, but he wanted to see if he could compete with the best players out on the tour.
Mm-hmm. And he worshipped, of all people, he worshipped Ben Hogan. It's not like nobody worships Ben Hogan. Heck, I mean, the guy was worship worthy. I mean, without a doubt, the guy he modeled himself after was Ben Hogan. Where did that affinity come from? I mean, you even write about how he would follow Hogan around in tournaments. After Jack finished playing, he'd go back out and, sneak around the course and watch Ben play.
Yeah, that was he told me that. He said from the beginning, when I started talking to him about this, that Hogan was his idol. And I think what happened, Warren, was when he was in his late teens in high school, he followed the game, like a lot of kids. He read the sports pages, and he saw Hogan's rise. Hogan didn't become great, until later on in his career. He had his struggles, but I think it was around 1940 that Hogan first won on the tour. And that stuck out in Jack's mind because he saw this guy named Hogan, won in North Carolina, and then he won 3 straight tournaments, shot these really great scores. And he just started following Hogan. He started following him in the newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he played on the winter tour, I think he never met him or played with him, but he was out there competing in some of the tournaments, and he kind of worshiped Hogan. And as you pointed out, he followed him and watched him practice to see how he prepared himself, and he would kind of duck behind trees so Hogan wouldn't see him.
It's crazy. One of the things, he modeled his game after Hogan. He wanted to be like Hogan. But you even said this just before, the one area of Jack's game that he really struggled with was his temper. Heck, you even wrote about the fact that Jack made a cut and left the course because he was so angry. How bad did Jack Fleck's temper affect his game?
It was I think that was one of the things he had to master in order to be able to be out there and play, because he just was so hard on himself. And his wife would talk to him about it. He would shoot pretty good scores, but he would be dissatisfied and think that he should have played better. And his anger would just get the best of him. And he told me, and that he knew he was going to have to manage that a lot better if he was going to be able to compete and play with the best. But honestly, even he was able to do that. But even I think until he finished playing his playing days, I think that was always a bit of a struggle for Jack. He just had such high standards for himself.
High standards. Did he struggle with his confidence? Was he confident enough in his game? I mean, where was that facet of Jack's game, confidence?
He was confident. I'd say he was pretty confident about his long game, meaning from tee to green, and he was a very good player. But he had trouble on the greens. He wasn't happy with his putting a lot of the time, and he could kind of go to a dark place if things weren't going that well. And golf will take you there. It's that kind of game. So I think he really struggled with a lot of negative thoughts and attitudes, and he had to fight that all along the way.
Mm-hmm. Here's a funny question, because he ultimately wins the U.S. Open, but up until that point, he hadn't won anything. So as you look back at his career prior to the U.S. Open, because things obviously change when you win a golf tournament, particularly the U.S. Open, did he really have the game to be a tour pro? And if he did, what prevented him from winning more often?
That's a great question. I would say he definitely had the game. He definitely had the game to be out there. And he should have won more. He put himself in position. He had a lot of thirds and fourths and fifths. When he finished his career, he had 3 PGA Tour wins. He always made cuts, and he had, I think, in something like almost 300 starts on tour. He had 41 top tens. So he was a good player. I think just like a lot of players, it's hard to close out a win. And I would say his biggest disappointment was that he didn't follow up his U.S. Open win in 1955 with another. He had a great chance at Cherry Hills, which is Arnold Palmer won. There were a bunch of guys that you don't even think about anymore because Palmer won there that could have won there. Hogan, Nicklaus, Fleck. And Jack was leading the tournament with 4 or 5 holes left. He was right there. And then he missed some putts, and it just sort of fell away from him. So, but he belonged out there on tour. He was out there for about 7 or 8 years. And all the guys I talked to said Jack was a good player, and he probably didn't get as much credit for being a good player because he didn't win. He didn't follow up that win after he beat Hogan, and he got some bad press.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he didn't win, and he put a lot of pressure on himself. So much so, if I follow the story correctly, heading into the 1955 season, that was basically it. Either he did something in 55, or that was going to be it. He wasn't going to play the tour anymore. If he didn't break through that year, how close did he come to actually leaving the game leading up to the 55 U.S. Open?
That was definitely a make or break season. And I think he had sort of this unwritten agreement with his wife that he would have a couple seasons out on the full circuit. So he might have been able to go out the next year too, but there just wasn't enough money out on the tour if you didn't win, if you didn't have some really high finishes. But you're right, it was make or break for Jack, and his game started coming together. He was playing pretty well. He could finish in the top 20 a lot, but Open victory, that changed his life. That changed everything for him.
Sure. You know, when you're finishing in the top 20, well, heck, in today's game of golf, if you make the cut, you make money. You can pay your expenses. You can play your caddy. I mean, the money is phenomenal. It wasn't that way back then. I mean, just because you finished in the top 20 didn't mean you made enough money to live. You're still coming up in the red, no?
You're absolutely right. I was looking at, things, and that was one of the things that was interesting to me about the book was, not only chronicling who this man was and what he accomplished, but what was that era like for the guys playing on the tour. I had Arnold Palmer and others tell me that you could make the cut and still not get a check because at a lot of tournaments, they only paid out 30 places. And I know that there was a tournament, I think it was in San Diego. I don't know, it was around this time frame where Jack might have finished in the top 30. He got a check for $14 and he had to pay his caddy 25. So his wife at one point said that for every dollar Jack made, he had to spend $8.
Oh my!
It really was not. You probably saw this, but the purse at the 55 Open where he won, the total purse for the whole field was $24,000.
Right, and he
And
won almost a quarter of that, right? He won like
he did.
6K.
He did. He did. And that was obviously, that was a lot more money then, but
Sure.
it's, it's nothing like since Tiger came along or since Palmer came along,
Yeah,
which really changed the economic landscape of the sport.
sure. Um, Obviously, when you're talking about Jack Fleck, the two big things you have to talk about are Ben Hogan and the U.S. Open. This U.S. Open in 1955 was played at Olympic in San Francisco. It was like the second or third ever Open played out west. It wasn't the norm to play a U.S. Open on the West Coast. Why did it take, if you know this, why did it take so long to get the Open out there? And how tough? Tell us about Olympic. Well, first let's talk about why did it take so long to get the Open back out in California to Olympic?
That, I'm not sure I know the answer to that, other than there had been so many great courses in the East, and that they would stage the U.S. Open Championship. And the first time it came out west was to Riviera in Los Angeles in 1948, which Hogan won.
Right.
It may have had, we've heard things like East Coast bias when it comes to sports. TV wasn't that big an issue, but there's differences in terms of the time and deadlines and how this tournament's going to be covered and probably how the public's going to receive it. I don't know how much that affected it, but it had been played east of the Mississippi pretty much the whole time, and now they were just starting to go west. And perhaps too that the courses in the West just didn't have the pedigree, or at least at that time, people didn't think of them as being the great courses. So, but okay, Olympic.
Yeah, that was a tough. I mean, what they did to that golf course, holy moly! Yeah, so talk about that.
So one of the things that happened in the early 50s was, and I never really, in my research, I never really got anyone to say this, but in 48, Hogan wins at Riviera. It's his first U.S. Open victory. He's going to go on to win 3 more and have a chance at the 5th at Olympic Club. Well, he broke the U.S. Open record. And so you get around to the early 50s. they started bringing in Robert Trent Jones to help with the setup of the courses and make them tougher. And this is really the time frame, I think, when the U.S. Open became known as being that toughest championship, where par is a really good score. In fact, if you shoot even par, you might win the tournament. And I think with the Olympic Club in 55, that's another thing. Maybe some of these West Coast courses, they have to agree to host a championship, and there's a lot of things they have to do. So, but the Olympic Club wanted their course to be a good course, a good place to stage a championship for these great players. And obviously, they didn't want the players to rip it apart. So they brought in Robert Trent Jones, who at that time was known as the course doctor, and he toughened it up. And it probably played, I think you can argue that it played as tough as any U.S. Open course has ever played, even to this day. Well, maybe Pebble Beach when Tiger won, but it played, they finished this tournament and Hogan and Fleck tied at 7 over par, and no one else was within 5 shots. So the course got set up, and it was probably a little bit too hard, and it really got into the play.
And didn't they have to? I think it was Sam Snead really laid into them just before the tournament started, and they did have to do some easing up on the course, did they not?
They did. Right before they teed off in the first round, they cut the rough back, but I don't really know that it helped these players that much. So Robert Trent Jones came in and he put in some more bunkers. The fairways were narrow, and the course, I think at one time they were worried about the rough. So they were worried about there being enough of rough. So they put 43 tons of fertilizer on the rough, several months out. And then they didn't cut it. And it was this, particular Italian rye, heavy, thick grass, that grew really well on the damp West Coast. Plus it was wet or damp the whole tournament because it's San Francisco. And all the players, pretty much everyone I talked to and everything I read about this, they'd never seen rough like this, and they would never see rough like this again.
They called the course a terror. The course was called the Terror.
Yeah, that was the San Francisco Chronicle put that in one of their stories before the Open, preview stories. And the players were losing golf balls like in practice. One player lost something like 12 golf balls. He was a pretty good player. And they were not. The story is, and this is one of the stories that came out about Jack after the Open, and when they started, I don't know, maybe being a little critical of him. It's like, well, they thought he was lucky or it was a fluke because they said he never broke 80 in a practice round. Well, that was true of a lot of other guys. They just really, if you strayed from the fairways, who knows what you were going to put on your scorecard. It was bad. Mm-hmm. But honestly, this gets into the reason why Jack did so well.
That's interesting to me because he had this temper, and I find it really interesting, and maybe you're going to go here, that he had this temper, but he didn't explode at Olympic. He was able to keep his cool and keep within himself and just probably concentrate the best he ever had. How did he do this? Why? Did he finally mature? Talk about his mental state going into the 55 US Open. And I'm sorry I interrupted, but you were going to this area. I just had to get this in here. Here's a guy that's known for losing his temper, and he's on this golf course that might possibly have been the most difficult golf course to play up until that time.
A lot of things came together for him that week that it just hadn't happened for him. I talked to Jack quite a bit about this because, in my mind, I thought for instance, he'd never played with Hogan. And the first time he plays with him, he's facing a 4-time US Open champion, the greatest player in a playoff. And he told me, Warren, I wasn't nervous. I felt composed. I had a calm that week. He said, he said, ask the Lord. He was a man who he had a spiritual aspect to his life. And I think there was something to that, definitely, for Jack. He had his game. His game was good. He loved the golf course. He always said that. He really loved the golf course. He had respect for Hogan, but he wasn't afraid to play with him. And he had his head on that week. You probably remember he's driving around at this time from tournament to tournament, and he's got a record player in his trunk. And, in the evenings, he's listening to this famous tenor at the time named Mario Lanza, who sang this song that was very popular called I'll Walk with God. And Jack just got to another place that he hadn't been to before. And I think it just served him really well that week. And probably, I don't know, he couldn't stay there. He didn't follow it up, but he did mature as a player. But that week he put it all together.
Yeah, he sure did. One of the other things really interesting about the U.S. Open, the 1955 U.S. Open, is the fact that he was basically playing brand new golf clubs. He was playing Ben Hogan golf clubs. He wanted a set of Ben Hogan golf clubs so darn bad. What was it, just that they had Ben Hogan's name on it? What was it that he liked so much about these clubs, and did that at all contribute to any sort of a relationship with Ben, for the better, for the worse? Was it indifferent? I mean, what was that like?
That really was the beginning of a connection they had. Who knew that they would meet at the Olympic Club in a playoff? But that whole connection with Hogan, he's watching this Hogan guy on the rise in the early 40s, late 30s as a teenager. And then he gets out there on tour. And then this particular season, earlier in the season, in the spring in Florida, he walks into a pro shop, and the pro there, Skip Alexander, is getting ready to send these irons back to the factory. And I think at that time, in the Hogan company's making clubs, Hogan's not really happy with, how they're coming out of production. So maybe that's why they're going back. But Jack had heard about him. Word had gotten around, I guess, and he went in with his couple of practice buddies, and he said, "Can I just take them out of the box and look at them before you send them back?" He said, "Sure, take a look." And he got them out, and he put them in his hands. He kind of waggled the irons, and he fell in love with them. Yeah, I think the fact they were Hogan's had something to do with it. But Hogan did make really good clubs. We saw that as he company. And he told his buddies, Walker Inman Jr. and a fellow named Mike Crack, he said, "I'm going to write to the Hogan company and see if they'll make me a set of clubs." And they sort of said, Jack, they don't know who you are. They're not going to make clubs for you. And Jack could be, Jack was, he had his ideas. He could be kind of hard headed and he knew what he wanted to do. And so he wrote, and within a week or two, he got a response that they would make him a set of clubs. And that really began the connection with Hogan. Later on, in May, he's in Fort Worth for the Colonial Invitational, where Hogan lives. And they invited him to go to the factory. And he was thrilled.
Like a kid in a candy shop, as the saying goes.
Absolutely thrilled. And he got there early during that week of that tournament, went out to the factory, and he's sitting waiting. And then out walks Ben Hogan and comes over and shakes his hand. And he can't believe, these things that are happening to him. So you're right. He gets a set of Hogan clubs, and he ends up being the first player to win with Hogan clubs, and he beats Ben Hogan. So you can't make this up.
Yeah, no, you can't. You can't. What was the likelihood of a guy like Jack Fleck winning the U.S. Open? I mean, how popular was he with the other players, the public? Only the best win this. And who is Jack Fleck to come out and not only win the U.S. Open, but beat Ben Hogan in doing so?
It took everybody by surprise. The players told me, and Arnold Palmer told me this too. Arnold Palmer in 1955 isn't the Arnold Palmer we know now. He's a mature player, but he hasn't done much in the pro ranks. But I talked to him. I talked to Bob Rosberg. I talked to a lot of these players who had seen Jack out on the winter tour, and they said, we knew he was a good player, but no one would have expected this from him at the U.S. Open against Hogan. As Rosberg told me, it's a quote in the book I've always remembered. He said it defied everything we knew about golf that Fleck could do this. The fans, the public, didn't really know who he was at all. But then he went from obscurity to fame, and all of a sudden everybody knew who he was. He went on the NBC Today show the day after. Ike, the president at the time, was in San Francisco. He had a meeting with him, and all of a sudden people know who Jack Fleck is. And that was both good and bad for him in a way, because he was an introvert. He was a loner. The attention, I think, dealing with the attention and the glare of that spotlight was not easy for him. But it did lead to a lot of opportunities that in golf for him that kind of helped him afterwards.
His journey to winning the U.S. Open did not start at the first hole. He had to qualify first. Tell us about that journey, how he had to qualify and then work his way through 4 rounds of golf to get into a playoff.
It was I know I keep saying this, whether it's the money or the travel or the golf courses, but it was so different back then. So
the tournament itself, right? Because the tournament was round 1 Thursday, round 2 Friday, and then you played rounds 3 and 4 on Saturday. They don't play 36 holes routinely.
Yeah, you're right. And so getting back to, he had to qualify. That was the way it was for almost everybody. I was revisiting this. I think something like 20 or fewer players were exempt into the 55 U.S. Open. It's so pretty much there's 162 men in the field, and all but 17, 18 players had to qualify. They had to go through sectional qualifying around the country at I don't know, something like 30 sites. And Jack qualified in Illinois outside of Chicago. And he didn't think he was going to make it. You know, he went out, they played a pretty tough qualifying course. And this is like, as you probably know, this is like a tournament in itself. You you have whatever 80, 100 guys trying to qualify, depending on what site it is in the country. They're trying to qualify for 2, 3, 4, 5 spots, and it was hard. It was really hard to qualify. And the other thing that I think needs to be mentioned is, you know, this is just another thing about Jack being such the underdog. He had only played in 2 U.S. Opens before. So the previous year in 54, he went to sectional qualifying and he didn't get a spot. And he was mad, he was mad about that. He was upset about it. He qualified in 53, which was played at Oakmont. Hogan won there. You know, Jack finished something like 50th something. And at Marion in 1950, Jack qualified for the first time and he missed the cut. So, you know, what some of these players told me was just getting in the US Open tournament and being able to play in it was a really big deal. It was like, except for the very best players, they wanted to win, but it was an honor just to be able to get up in that tournament.
Mm-hmm. He had, I would say, in reading your book, The Longest Shot, he had, for whatever reason, a calm, cool confidence going into this particular tournament. I mean, he predicted to his hometown paper back in Iowa that he would finish in the top 10. Was that just something to say during an interview, or do you think he honestly believed he would? And if he did, why? Why did Jack Fleck think he had the game to contend, finish in the top 10 at the U.S. Open at this terror of a course, the Olympic Club of all places? Why was he so confident? Especially, he'd never won a tournament before.
I'm not sure about that, why he was. I think he felt like he was playing pretty well. And I know once he got out there, I'm not sure exactly when he talked to the sports editor at, you know, one of the Davenport papers, but when he got out there and he saw the course, he really liked it. He just felt good about it. And Warren, he felt his chances were better because the course was so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jack was not a birdie machine, but the U.S. Open was a different breed of golf championship. This course would demand that you hit the ball, you know, well off the tee, that you're a good iron player. It had small greens, you know, you had to hit good approach shots. And this was Jack's forte. And I just think he had the Hogan clubs. And by the way, he puts new wedge. Hogan brings the wedge when he gets the irons. The wedges aren't finished, and Hogan brings the wedges to Olympic, and gives them to him in the locker room before the tournament starts. Now, can you imagine a player nowadays putting new wedges in their bag like a day?
Yeah, they're going to use it for weeks, practice with it for weeks before they put it into play.
I know. So there was something about Olympic. He also, I think he was determined. You know, maybe he was trying to pump himself up a little bit. He knew that if he could finish in the top 10, he wouldn't have to go through qualifying in 56. And he really wanted to avoid qualifying if he could. You know, if you finished in the top 10, you'd be among those handful of players that would be exempt. So that was his goal. And that's what I guess he just decided to tell the sports editor. he also told them they ought to get out there and cover the tournament, but they didn't end up sending anybody out there until Saturday night, late Saturday night, and one of the sports writers flew across the country, in the middle of the night to cover the playoff once Fleck got in the playoff against Hogan.
Yeah, yeah. You also write about something in the book very unique that he did not reveal for many, many years. The morning of that final 36 holes, when he heard a voice say he was going to win the Open, and he's convinced that he heard this voice. What about that? Was this Jack's Field of Dreams moment?
Well, I'd say yes. It was. It was. And I thought, okay, how am I going to write about this? And I remember sitting with him in Fort Smith, Arkansas in 2010, and we went into a lot of these things. And I said, let's talk about that. And he said he heard it not once, but twice as he went into the bathroom to shower, and he's standing in front of the mirror with his razor in his hand, and he hears this voice says, Jack, you're going to win the Open. And he said like the hair on the back of his neck stood up or something like that. He had a physical reaction to it, and he kind of looked around as if somebody was in the room, but there wasn't. He was the only one in the room. And then he heard it again. And he, at the time I'm talking to him, Jack's in his late 80s, and he does not deviate. He's been very consistent about what he has said about this.
Mm-hmm.
But he did not tell anybody that
Mm-hmm.
for like 40 years.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it. The movie Field of Dreams, Iowa. Jack, Iowa. It must be something to do with Iowa. How funny is that?
Yeah. And he said, I didn't really tell anybody about that. There are some stories that came out after the Open where he, his hometown papers covered everything he was doing. And he said he felt that there was a power that was guiding him. And I think he was definitely talking about God. And, but he didn't really tell this story about hearing the voice until I think it was the 90s when he was interviewed by Peter Kessler of the Golf Channel. And I think Peter Kessler, was a very good interviewer, had heard about this. And Jack told me, he said, I would never said anything, but he pulled it out of me.
Mm. Mm.
So it was, for Jack, there was definitely a spiritual aspect to this, all of this. And he felt this really sort of kinship with Hogan. He loved Hogan. In fact, he even had some misgivings about beating Hogan.
Yeah, there was a little bit of guilt there.
There was.
The playoff against Hogan was actually pretty amazing. So they play 72 holes. They're tied at the end, and they have to play the 18-hole playoff. They get into this playoff. It was like about the first 5 or 6 holes. They're even, no blood. They're matching par for par. And Jack makes the first birdie to go up on Hogan. He never looked back. Hogan never once led in the playoff. Tell us about the playoff and how incredible it was.
Well, I think one of the things that I read from the accounts, newspaper accounts and everything, things that were written about it at the time, was that people were surprised at how composed Jack Fleck looked. He was hitting good golf shots, and Hogan Hogan played well in the playoff. You know, he did. Hogan played well in the tournament. He played well enough to win. It's just no one saw Jack Fleck coming. But Jack played was composed. Hogan had a chance to take the lead, I think, on an early hole, but he missed about a 4-foot birdie putt. And Jack, who maybe had the best putting week of his life in this tournament, as you said, he made a birdie, and he got out in front of Hogan by about 3 shots, and he was able to hold on. Hogan couldn't catch him. Hogan came back, and Hogan didn't give up, but Jack was able to just hold on to his lead, and they got to the 18th hole, and he had a 1-shot lead, and Hogan famously hit the ball into the rough on that last hole. And I found out a little bit about that. The story's always been, everything I'd ever read was Hogan hooked the ball, but he slipped. He slipped on the tee. He was trying to reach back for a little bit more. He's hitting his driver, and his right foot slipped, and he just kind of pulled his tee shot into the rough, because he needed a birdie at that last hole to tie Fleck, and then he ended up taking a double. Mm-hmm. But Jack told me again and again and again, because I would ask him, he said, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't.
He had nothing to lose. He had nothing to lose.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people, the players, if you think about, a lot of people know Tiger, of course, his time has passed now, but he was a very intimidating player. He was a dominant player, and some others, and players, that would affect players, playing head to head with him. And I think Hogan was the same way. But
I don't think anybody could have been more intimidating than Hogan based off of everything we read and learned about him, his stare, his ability to concentrate. I don't know, as intimidating as Tiger Woods was, I don't know if there's anybody ever been as intimidating as Ben Hogan.
No, and he was, he just went about his business. He didn't talk much, and he really knew how to control his golf ball around a golf course. And everybody thought, coming into 55, Ben Hogan has won 4 out of the last 6 U.S. Opens he's played in. So he's the guy to beat. Everybody thought that. So getting back to Jack and his mentality, how could he do this? What's really unusual about him is he's a David. It is sort of David versus Goliath. He, like David in that old Bible story, he's not afraid, and he's not intimidated, and he's able to play the best he's ever played on the biggest stage of his life. And I think, I don't know. I think he, as good as he played, I think as he would look back on that, he probably was a bit surprised himself.
Mm-hmm. How did winning the U.S. Open change his life?
Well, he kind of got the monkey off his back. He had won. He had told his wife that he wanted to prove to himself that he could play with players like Hogan and Snead before those guys left the game. And certainly by winning the U.S. Open. Sam Snead, by the way, came in a tie for third at Olympic. Sam Snead never won a U.S. Open. Really kind of a tragic figure. He had 4 seconds. But he, along with Hogan, they were the 2 best players of that era. Jack went on. There were opportunities for him. And he'd come from these modest means, and he knew that he should try to take advantage of that for his sake and the sake of his family. At that time, they said it was worth something like, in terms of exhibitions and uh, sponsorship opportunities, etc., $75 to $100,000, which we think now it's like that's not very much money, but then it was.
Back then,
And
in 55, sure.
it helped him kind of set himself up financially and help his family, but it took something away from his golf game, and he sort of went into a tailspin the next few, because he's kind of running around, going to banquets, and I'm going to play this golf ball, and I'm going to wear these sweaters, and I'm going to play in this exhibition. I think he felt like I really needed to take advantage of these opportunities, but it wasn't really good for his game. And he was a solitary man who liked to practice, who liked to do his yoga, who traveled alone. And all of this, a lot of this stuff that he did was probably a really big distraction for him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't want people to think that that was it for Jack Fleck, because, like you said earlier, he did have a chance to win another U.S. Open, 1958 Cherry Hills. He was in contention all the way into the final few holes, and he won in 1960 the Phoenix Open, and he won in 1961 the Bakersfield Open. What I find unique is he won the 55 U.S. Open in a playoff for win number one. His second win was in a playoff in 1960, and his third win was in a playoff in 1961. Very unique. He was a good golfer. Probably because he only won those three tournaments, didn't get the respect or notoriety that he really deserved, as you also pointed out. The biggest win obviously coming in that 1955 U.S. Open. In the end, what is the legacy of Jack Fleck? Should he be remembered more? And did his accomplishments fall short of his potential?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say that Jack would feel as if he should have won another major, and he could have won a few more events on tour. So he had those regrets. But I think his legacy, I'm hoping that it changed around the time that this book came out in 12. It was the perfect time because the US Open came back to Olympic that year. And I didn't plan that, but it was just perfect. And by then, see, Ben, of course, Jack outlived Ben Hogan, and Ben Hogan cast a long shadow. Ben Hogan died in the mid to late 90s, I think 97 or something like that. This story had always sort of been, a lot of times it had been told in Hogan biographies or other books. It was the one that Hogan lost. It hadn't really been told from the standpoint of a great underdog story. So I think that people notice of Jack's accomplishment more when the US Open came back to Olympic Club, and he was there. We were there together, but he was there, and the USGA recognized him in a way that he hadn't been recognized. He and Billy Casper did a lot that week. Olympics kind of known now as the place where the underdog wins. Casper beat Palmer there. Fleck beat Hogan there. I think Scott Simpson won there. Watts supposed to win. There's something strange going on out there at Olympic, but Jack got a lot more visibility and I think exposure for the player that he was. And so But I think his legacy is always going to be the guy who beat Hogan and being this great underdog story. I really wanted to tell people with this book, I wanted to report I wanted to find out what actually happened. And what I found out was that it wasn't a fluke. He might not have been better than Hogan, but he was better that week. And Hogan played really well. And Hogan always treated Fleck well. So I think his legacy is he's a deserving US Open champion. He's not a fluke. And he was a pretty darn good player.
Yeah. Well, Neil, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day and spending it with us here on Sports Forgotten Heroes. It's really fun. We don't get to talk about guys like Jack Fleck all that often. And, like you said, when it went back to when the Open was back at Olympic, you were there, and he was honored when he was there. And in just another year, it's going to be the 70th anniversary of his victory in 1955. So maybe it'll come to light again. But hey, we talked about it. People will listen, and Jack's name will be out there. And once again, I thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
I really appreciate the opportunity, Warren. It's been great talking with you.
Fleck ultimately won 3 times on the tour, managed 4 non-tour victories, and won twice on the senior tour. His was a career full of promise, and one in which he should have probably won more. While he didn't, he certainly fulfilled his potential over one magical weekend in 1955 when he stood atop the world of golf, having conquered one of the most difficult golf courses ever and outlasted one of the game's most mythical figures. Thanks again to Neil for sharing so much time with us. Thanks to all of you for listening. And we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten